The damp of early summer had not yet lifted. The air still carried the smell of scorched earth mixed with the salt blown in from the sea as Hiroshi Nakayama walked along the hastily repaired road, being led toward the camp gate by an American sergeant. His steps were unsteady because he had no idea what kind of order he was walking into. He was neither a prisoner nor a formal employee, but a temporary technician marked as a civilian railway craftsman, an identity that, on land torn apart by war, had no real stability. He had only one goal: stay alive. For a craftsman raised in wartime, being alive was all the explanation there was. When the wooden gate outside the wire suddenly swung open, his shoulders twitched uncontrollably. It wasn't the sound of the door, but the scene behind it that magnified a pressure he had never experienced before. 2 American soldiers were carrying huge metal drums of milk protein powder, each drum almost as wide across as his waist, reflecting a dark, heavy shine under the sun. It wasn't his first time seeing American supplies, but he had never seen so many at once. A dozen-odd drums stacked side by side, like a dense silver wall. His first reaction was not amazement, but panic. Such surplus meant a kind of capability, a capacity to afford waste, a form of order that lay far beyond anything he understood. His legs stopped moving of their own accord. As the 2 soldiers walked with the drums, their stride sent a faint tremor through the ground. Dust jumped at the tips of his shoes. His body tightened in an almost exaggerated way, as if the shaking came not from weight, but from some kind of pressure being applied. From wartime propaganda, he knew the image of giant American soldiers, but those giants had always been abstract, paper threats on posters. The real tremor made him instinctively treat their muscles, their breathing, their equipment, even the metal buckles on their belts, as sources of danger. He knew he was overreacting, but he had no way to pull back. He was assigned to a warehouse being used to temporarily store tools for railway emergency repairs. The supplies stacked inside followed the same strict format. Compressed grain cakes packed into thick paper boxes, every edge identical, with none of the patching, resewing, or rewrapping so common in wartime. He had assumed such items were some kind of luxury extra for American soldiers, but the warehouse clerk merely gestured for him to record the numbers and walked away. No one watched over him, no one barked orders. The absence of supervision made him more nervous. In his world, restraint and supervision came as a pair. If supervision was missing, it meant the unknown, and the unknown meant danger. That night he was put in a work shed on the edge of the camp to sleep. The camp lights in the distance blinked on and off in a steady cycle. He tried to relax, but kept replaying the images of supplies he had seen during the day. In his mind he enlarged the milk powder drums, made the grain cakes harder and denser, widened the soldiers' chests by another inch. Exaggeration was an unconscious reflex, as if he were using made-up proportions to explain a real threat. His breathing grew shallow and rapid in the dark, a faint ache spreading in his chest. He wasn't afraid of any specific person. He was afraid he would never find a foothold inside this vast order. At dawn, he was sent to the railhead to help dismantle and inspect bombed-out sleepers. Walking along the path outside the camp, he was passed by supply convoys. Gasoline fumes mixed with the smell of wet soil. Each jeep that swept by brushed him with a pressure of displaced air that made him step back, as if he were giving way to some larger life form. He noticed the drivers' bodies, their wrists as thick as posts. His heartbeat did not quite lose control, but the rhythm was clearly off. He tried to reason his fear into something he could understand, but no words seemed to fit. He came from a society where restraint was instinct, where energy was always meted out with precision. Here, plenty was not waste, but a structural fact. He realized he did not understand that structure, and his fear deepened again. At noon, he was temporarily sent to deliver rations to the POW compound. All the way there, he kept adjusting his stride, unsure how one should enter an area that held enemy prisoners. In Japan's wartime logic, POWs meant instability, something to be watched and guarded at all times. But here, the gate to the compound was casually guarded by 2 Americans, one of them leisurely drinking from a metal cup. An illogical image flashed through his mind, giants at rest, unconcerned that the ants might run away while they were relaxing. The comparison made his spine tighten. He set the rations down in the designated place and saw the prisoners lining up quietly. No uproar, no scuffles, no demands. Suddenly his fear felt both justified and absurd, as if he alone were viewing the world from a different scale. A few days later he was working with American engineers on bridge repairs along the line. He noticed that when they moved heavy loads, they hardly used any shouted commands and never snapped at one another. When they set tools down, the movements were steady and gentle. The stability of the system showed itself through such gestures. That only made him more tense. He couldn't understand how such ease did not produce chaos. Pulled back and forth by this contradiction, he grew distracted, even writing down the wrong figure when recording track gauge. When he noticed the mistake, his anxiety surged. He felt certain this could cost him his life. Yet the American engineer simply crossed out the line and told him to write it again, without a word of scolding. For a second, his shoulders loosened and then tightened again in panic. He was alarmed by his own sense of relief. That night, for the first time, he started shaking and could not stop. It wasn't the cold or any illness. It was his body's reaction to an order he did not understand. He was not in immediate danger, yet felt danger could descend at any moment. His fear no longer came from American strength, but from his inability to predict how that strength would operate. He could not explain why such a seemingly mild system made him so uneasy. Fear seeped into his muscles and his breath, fermenting quietly in the dark. Over the next few days, his behavior began to change in small ways. He started silently noting down every surplus, every stack, every line, every rhythm he saw, as if trying to catch hold of some rule he could not grasp. But with each entry, he felt a faint shame. In the logic he knew, the enemy's order was not supposed to be more stable than his own country's. Reality, however, refused to be denied. Shame and fear mixed together, giving his reflexive retreats in front of American soldiers an even more exaggerated quality. Soon the camp entered a new resupply cycle. Large quantities of food crates were unloaded into the open space in front of the warehouse. Dark stenciled numbers covered the sides of the boxes, their edges forming almost perfectly straight lines. It was the first time he had seen resupply on this scale, and the sight left him gasping. Dust swirled in the air as crates hit the ground. His eyes tracked the numbers across the surfaces, as if he were watching the articulated body of some huge creature. Each block of numbers represented an unbroken stream of supplies, and the production capacity hidden behind them unsettled him more than any open hostility. He was told to help count the crates. The form he was given used the standard American layout: uniform horizontal lines, fixed character spacing, nearly mechanical blanks for each entry. His fingers shook as he filled in the first row. The writing slanted visibly. He wasn't afraid of punishment so much as being unable to adapt in the face of such tightly organized order. The stronger the system's stability, the more he felt like a tiny grain of sand pressed into the ground. He recopied the form 3 times before he could accept it. That evening, waiting outside the warehouse for the next assignment, he saw several American soldiers handing out some of the compressed grain cakes to POWs. The soldiers didn't measure the pieces precisely, nor did they fuss over small discrepancies. Corners of the cakes crumbled in their hands and fell to the dirt, and nobody treated it as a serious waste. His chest tightened all at once. Back in Japan, every crumb was something you were duty-bound to prevent losing, almost a moral charge. Here, surplus did not mean loss of control. It was a budgeted buffer inside the system. He could not understand how such extra did not lead to disorder. Fear rose again, deeper this time, because it sprouted from ideas, not from the environment. That night, he replayed the moment that piece of cake hit the ground. In his mind, he inflated it to the weight of a stone and magnified its impact into the sound of a board cracking in 2. He was not trying to dramatize things. His mind was grasping for explanations for an order he could not comprehend. That way of explaining only made him more uneasy. In his sleep, he heard, again and again, the sound of crates being stacked in the camp, magnified into thunder until it jolted him awake. He sat up, drenched in sweat, as if he had just failed to outrun something. Time went on, and his behavior grew more cautious. He unconsciously steered clear of the largest American soldiers, even when they were merely passing by. He avoided lingering in open spaces too long because stacks of supply crates and milk powder drums made him feel like he was standing under the shadow of a huge force. He knew these reactions made little sense, but had no way to shed them. Fear did not burn like fire. It seeped into his bones like water, slow and thorough. One day he was sent to help inspect temporary sleepers on a stretch of track. As he crouched in the mud, he heard heavy footsteps behind him. The muscles in his back tensed at once. His tools nearly slipped from his hands. He was sure the person behind him would bark an order or accuse him of something, that some mistake would be pinned on him. But when the engineer passed, he merely set a length of timber down beside him with a quiet, steady thud. The man hadn't even really noticed him. That was what sent his heart hammering out of control, not fear of the engineer, but fear of his own assumption that every source of strength would inevitably bear down on him. He suddenly realized that inside this camp his scale of the world had been completely inverted. He was someone who had grown up in restraint and tension, and now he had been placed in a structure that ran on surplus, where everything was larger, heavier, and broader than what he knew. That breadth left him at a loss. Restraint had been a form of protection. Surplus was a form of power. He had no idea how to live inside power, and so his fear did not ease. It deepened in everyday life. The first obvious physical break came one noon. He was checking a rail joint, metal creaking quietly in the heat, the smell of diesel thick in the air. From a distance he saw several American soldiers hoist a supply crate that looked to him absurdly huge. Watching them lift it onto a truck with easy, coordinated motions, his heart clenched and his vision went grey. He dropped to his knees. He didn't faint, but his body refused to hold him. It felt as if he had been forced to confront a fact beyond his grasp, and the fact itself had briefly shut his mind down. It took him several minutes to get his breathing under control. The soldiers hadn't noticed him. No one shouted at him for stopping work. That easy indifference troubled him even more. He had no idea whether he still had a stable place in this world. He was neither important nor needed, and in a system of abundance, that in-between status felt terrifying. That evening in the shed, he sat on a crate and silently counted his breaths. He tried to use the logic of restraint to explain the Americans, but every explanation was swallowed by the sheer surplus. Fear was no longer being triggered. It had taken up permanent residence somewhere inside, like a latent heat that kept his nerves stretched thin and brittle. By now, the line of fear, the line of observation, and the line of survival were tightly braided together. He could still work and still follow orders, but he had formed a new habit. Whenever he saw supplies on any kind of scale, or a particularly large soldier, his heart rate spiked, his field of vision narrowed, and his body curled inward just a little. The reaction never pushed him into collapse, but it quietly laid the groundwork for everything that would come after. One morning, with the wind from the camp brushing his cheeks, he noticed that his body was no longer as rigid as when he first arrived. He still feared the Americans' size and strength, but within that fear, a thin crack had appeared. A dangerous curiosity. He began paying attention to the rhythm of their movements, to where they placed their tools, to the steps by which supplies were unloaded from trucks. He told himself he was observing for the sake of survival, but in truth his observation was slowly turning from passive to active, and that shift in itself carried instability. One morning he was sent to the rail yard to move tool chests. They were heavy, and 2 American engineers could carry one without strain. Watching them, he caught 2 details. They barely spoke commands, yet their actions matched, and when they set the chest down, there was no extra bang or scrape. His chest tightened under the pressure again, but within the tightness, something else stirred. He wanted to imitate that strength. His toes leaned forward just a fraction, as if trying to copy the angle and firmness of their footfalls. He had no idea why he was doing it, or what restless impulse lay behind that furtive imitation. For the first time, a hazy thought crossed his mind. If Japan had this kind of surplus and this kind of stability, would the railways be less fragile than they were now? The idea lasted only an instant, but it sent a chill down his spine. He didn't dare pursue it. That evening he opened the notebook he had been keeping in secret. It had originally held only gauge measurements and sleep accounts, but in recent days it had begun filling up with odd entries. Height of stacked grain cakes versus width of queues, Supply cycle for milk, protein drums, length and rhythm of American soldiers' strides, time intervals between unloading phases. On their own, those entries had seemed like scattered notes. Lined up on the pages, they took on the shape of a hidden structure. Staring at them, he felt a strange excitement, as though he were the only person who could see the internal pattern of American order. He had never observed his own country this way, nor had he looked at the railway system from such an angle. Realizing that shook him so badly he almost couldn't breathe. He snapped the notebook shut as if slamming a dangerous object closed. Then he wedged it into a crack between the shed's boards and pushed until the wood creaked. In the days that followed, his fear became less pure. Out on the line, he still felt his heart pound when Americans lifted heavy boxes, but now, mingled with the anxiety, was a hidden urge to prove that he could understand that strength, even if he could never possess it. He searched for patterns in the engineers' movements, for order in the way equipment was arranged. His attention grew sharper and finer, as if he were trying to decipher a language he was not supposed to learn. That intense observation brought out a second thread, a swelling sense of superiority. When he left the camp and passed the nearby Japanese civilian settlements, he began seeing the people there with a strange new gaze. They were thin, cautious, brows furrowed, using what little strength they had to keep life going. He watched them wrap their scant food in worn cloth, watched them save every handful of wood shavings for fuel. He knew he ought to live just as frugally. But in his mind rose the image of the American warehouse with its stacked drums of milk protein. Suddenly he felt he knew something they did not. He knew how the giants ate, how they walked, how they organized their supplies. He imagined that gave him some tiny proximity to power, even if that power was not his. The feeling was fragile, but strong enough that, in front of strangers, he sometimes caught himself standing a little straighter. There was even one absurd instant. When an old man asked if the American camp was dangerous, a wild thought flashed through his mind. He wanted to say, "You will never understand that order." He did not say the words aloud, but the mere fact that such a thought had appeared made his skin crawl. He could not trace where the feeling came from. He only knew that for a moment he had felt lifted to a height that did not belong to him. One night, as he was stacking crates outside the shed, he heard a few indistinct whispers somewhere in the dark. The sound was not sharp, but it felt like a needle to the skin. At once, he thought of diehards conspiring or someone who had seen him studying the American system. His heart raced. He imagined people storming into the shed at night to deal with him as a traitor. Even his footsteps softened, as if afraid of alarming the air itself. There was no basis for this fear, but it grew layer by layer. He didn't know where the voices had come from, or whether they had anything to do with him at all. He only knew he was now far more prone to connect any rustle of grass or scrape of wood with danger. As these emotions advanced together, he no longer felt only tension or dread. His reactions branched in multiple directions. When an American engineer handed him a tool, he felt crushed by the man's strength. When he carried the tool back to the shed, he felt briefly inflated because he had been in contact with a giant's instrument. When the iron gate of the POW compound clanged, he worried someone might escape, and also that he might be blamed. When he saw stacked supplies, he feared the abundance, and yet wanted to understand it. He continued working inside this confused but ever-deepening psychological tremor. One afternoon, he was helping the Americans measure around a bridge support. He watched an engineer lift a heavy steel beam with a motion that seemed almost effortless. The beam's weight was more than enough to break his arm, yet the man's shoulders only dipped a little. His body shook as if he were witnessing something beyond biology. At the same time, he caught himself copying the engineer's breathing, trying to sync his own body with that strength. He knew it was impossible, but could not stop the impulse. On the way back, it suddenly struck him that he had already begun unconsciously adopting American ways of moving. He pressed his steps more firmly into the ground, straightened his back, and even copied the engineer's angle of stride when stepping over gaps in the track. He could not tell if this was natural adaptation or a kind of obsession. He only knew he was being drawn toward a new order. That night, he dug out the notebook again. On a blank page, he wrote, "These aren't strength. They're surplus. His hand shook noticeably as he finished the line. He knew that he had just raised his observations to the level of explanation, and that the explanation itself had crossed beyond what wartime thinking would permit. Staring at the words, he felt fear, guilt, pride, and anxiety all climbing at once. It was as if he were facing a huge echo not from outside, but from within. For the first time, he understood that his inner world was drifting away from his old one. Within days, his behavior entered a new phase. Fear no longer ruled everything, but each time he pushed it down, it flowed back in more hidden forms. At the worksite, he moved with a strange tension, cautious yet excited, self-effacing yet puffed up. Every action carried two opposing emotions and made him look like someone constantly testing his limits in foreign terrain. One day he was told to help level the path from the POW compound to the work area. A short stretch, just mud and gravel to be relayed. He expected it to be no different from any other job until he saw the POWs being led out in groups. They walked in lines, strides in unison, faces calm. No agitation, no tight, watchful fear. It startled him to realize he was watching their gait and comparing it to the Americans. The prisoners' movements were lighter, their rhythm shorter. For a moment he had the strange impression that he could see the difference between two kinds of order with his own eyes. It thrilled him, but the thrill was swallowed at once by guilt. He worried that this sensitivity would drag him somewhere dangerous, but he couldn't bring himself to look away. As his capacity to observe grew, his sense of superiority grew more secret and sharp. Resting in the shed, he studied the other Japanese conscript workers in silence. They used old methods to organize tools. Their movements were taut and hurried. He suddenly felt that he understood a higher level of order, while they still lived entirely within the scale of restraint. The thought made his heart race, warmth rising in his chest. He knew this feeling was wrong, but it swelled anyway, a silent gas expanding in the dark. He told himself not to let such ideas surface, yet with every contact with the Americans, they did. At the same time, the shadow of guilt lengthened. The more he unconsciously copied American habits inside the camp, the more uneasy he felt when he walked back through Japanese neighborhoods. Passing a fenced yard where several old men sorted firewood and grain, his steps sped up of their own accord, as if he were dodging the gaze of an older world. He had done nothing wrong, yet he felt as though any elder's glance might pierce through to the changes inside him. He even conjured an exaggerated scene in his mind. Someone stopping him to ask why he had learned the enemy's ways. It never happened, but his nerves were taut as if it might. On that cramped dirt road, his walk turned almost into flight. Caught between swelling pride and expanding guilt, his mind began to vibrate, close-strung between two poles. On one side, he felt he had to protect his new knowledge. On the other, he felt ashamed for having it at all. His world split into two scales, Japan of restraint, America of surplus. He stood between them, pulled hard from both ends. Meanwhile, a quiet fantasy of rebuilding took root. Watching American engineers replace a steel beam on the line, he was struck by the solidity of their division of labor. In a flash, he thought that if Japan someday had crews who worked together like this, perhaps the railways would no longer have to survive on overstrained thrift. For the first time, he understood he was learning these methods not only to stay alive, but to search for some possible future. He never said it aloud, but in his mind he began sketching a picture. The war would end, the country would rebuild, and he could keep records for that moment. That hope, however, became a new source of anxiety. He tried to distill a few key principles in his notebook. Work rhythm not driven by high-pressure orders. Engineers using surplus as the safety baseline, not minimal consumption. Distribution system with built-in redundancy, where stability is not sacrificed for frugality. With every line he wrote, his fingers trembled. He knew these ideas had hardly any place in wartime Japan. Restraint was iron law. Surplus could easily be denounced as betrayal. The more he wrote, the tighter he became, as if recording something that should never be recorded. At one point, he tore several pages out and threw them into a muddy puddle outside the shed, only to bend down minutes later, frantic, and fish the soaked paper back out. He could not bear to lose it, and did not dare keep it. He trapped himself in a loop of ripping and retrieving. At the same time, his outward behavior grew more exaggerated. He started copying the Americans' stable stance when standing, and their way of using their waist to carry toolboxes. He did not realize he was changing his body habits. He only felt that he could control the tools better. But his forced tension and overwrought imitation twisted his posture. He seemed at once stiff and heavy, as if trying to project some of their strength into his own body, but only managing a distorted shadow. One afternoon, as he was helping move iron pieces, he stopped dead, not from fatigue, but because he realized he had begun treating some American habits as inherently correct, unconsciously applying them as standards in his own judgments. Without saying anything, he had already placed his fellow Japanese workers and American soldiers on two different scales. His sense of superiority swelled again, and so did his guilt. All of this came to a head through something very small. In the afternoon, a faint metallic clink sounded outside the shed. He didn't see what caused it, but the sound brought a familiar jolt. His back tightened, his heart sped up, and he automatically stepped back 3 paces. He thought it might be some kind of signal or a deliberate warning from someone who had been watching him. He knew it was irrational, but he could not help it. Fear, guilt, and the feeling of being watched wound together in that instant, and for a moment he could not tell what was real. He even imagined someone hidden in the dark, secretly recording his every note and gesture, waiting for a chance to take revenge. When he finally realized it had only been an engineer dropping a tool, he did not feel relief, only shame at his own reaction. He was angry at himself for being so sensitive and afraid that his sensitivity was some kind of ominous sign. That night, with the notebook open on his knees, he sat speechless for a long time. He understood now that he had gone too far and that the shape of his fear was changing. He had once feared American bodies and strength. Now he feared how close he had come to that strength. His heart swayed between dread and desire like a board being slapped over and over by waves. One afternoon, he was walking along a path on the edge of the camp when he saw 2 Japanese standing beneath the eaves of an abandoned house. Their clothes were ragged, their expressions weighed down by hunger. Just as he was about to pass, both pairs of eyes turned toward him. His chest seized, as if hooked by their gaze. There was no threat in it, no gesture, but his body stepped back half a pace all the same. He suddenly realized they might recognize him, and they might recognize the world he was approaching. It was only a fleeting second, but it marked the point where his inner framework began to fracture. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched cropped up again and again. While he hauled tools on the line, several Japanese laborers he did not know stood at a distance and watched him. Their eyes held no hostility, but he felt a chill of exclusion. In his mind, exaggerated images played out, someone following him, someone waiting to attack at night, someone blaming him as someone who sided with the enemy. He knew it was fear twisting reality, but he could not stop. One night in the shed, riffling through his notebook, he suddenly realized he had already amassed enough observations about American systems to be dangerous. He had wanted to take them back to Japan to help rebuild, but now, for the first time, he wondered if they would simply bring him trouble. He tore out a page, then, overcome by guilt, picked it back up. His hands shook between ripping and rescuing. Fear and a sense of duty pulled him apart, forcing him into a nearly suffocating stalemate. The real crisis came quietly, in an almost undramatic way. One evening, after a job on the tracks, a timber slipped because he mislaid a tool, exhausted. The beam did not hit anyone, but the sound of it hitting the ground was heavy and sharp. He collapsed where he stood, convinced the accident would be laid at his feet, that it would become an insult and bring punishment. His breathing turned wild. His face went white. In his panic, he leapt to an absurd conclusion that Japan's defeat was due to the weakness of technicians like him, and that he was the embodiment of that weakness. He felt the whole weight of the war on his shoulders and was nearly crushed by his own self-blame. Yet the American engineers simply refixed the timber, handed him back his tools, and motioned for him to carry on. No accusations, no humiliation, no judgment on his worth at all. Their calm, unhostile movements wrapped him in a different kind of air, solid, wide, not asking him to prove his value, not using disaster as a unit of measurement. His fear did not vanish in that moment, but it stopped expanding. In the weeks that followed, his mind slowly settled into a stability he had never known. The American system did not ask for loyalty, sacrifice, or any explanation of his fear. It only asked that he follow procedures and ensured those procedures could be trusted. For the first time, he experienced an order that did not run on punishment or feed on shame. By comparison, his old world shrank, tightened, and darkened. He realized he no longer fit there, and that world could no longer take in someone who had seen another kind of order. When the war ended, he felt neither joy nor sorrow at the news. Standing before the warehouse piled with supplies, those same drums and crates he had feared, mimicked, envied, and recorded, he felt only a final exhaustion. He knew he could never return to his old social logic. Restraint had once been a way to survive, but surplus was what kept the world from falling apart. After the war, the Americans announced that some technicians would be taken to the mainland to help restore the railways. When he received the notice, he did not hesitate, and he did not exult. He simply accepted it quietly, like someone who had finally found a structure that could bear his fragmented self. He left that land with the group. Stepping onto the transport ship, he looked back at the shore, feeling no tearing grief, only a calm sense of withdrawal. He did not believe he was choosing America. He simply understood that only this system could hold together all the parts of him that fear had torn and patched back together. America did not heal him. It merely gave him a world that did not rely on fear to stay in one piece. And so he stepped out of the world of restraint and into the world of surplus. Not for power, but so he would not be devoured by his own fear.